He's Howard Ibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of two books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 28 years of experience. Together, Henry and I are the Brief Brothers. We love talking about advertising, creative briefs, and briefing. Henry, we're back with another episode. Today is part two of our conversation with Christopher Owens, head of brand strategy at the TRG in Dallas. Let's keep going. Well, you know Greg Benedict. He's on LinkedIn. You may have followed him, but he likes to post. He has a posting that he does regularly called "Oh Great Advertising, How I Missed You." And then he posts an ad and he's got a Roman numeral that follows it because he has been doing this sequentially for many years, and his Roman numerals are now about out to here. But the premise of his post and his argument is that we are in a creative malaise, if I can be so bold as to summarize what he's saying. Do you agree with that? Are we in a creative malaise, or are we in the early stages of a creative renaissance? Is the golden age of advertising a one-off, or are we? What do you
I
think?
think part of what he's commenting on is this kind of like era of average, where and you see, just countless posts of that often depict all the, New York Times best-selling books have the same cover. All the cars look the same. All of the new, apartment complexes look the same, et cetera. That this
The bell curve.
law of averaging gets us to normalizing as opposed to exceptionalizing, right? And I still strongly believe that we are in the industry of exceptionalizing, to the best of our, ability, and that effectiveness then is a team sport, and it is championing the resources of every single discipline, including the client. And oh, don't forget the real people that we're actually trying to move out there in the market, that also have their own impressions and of what is this versus that, when it comes to the choices, that they're making. And so it's often the job now has become just orchestrating all of that knowledge and understanding. And then, as you've mentioned, is a couple times, and it's almost cliche to talk about, but we can't underestimate the power of machine learning and AI coming in as an assistant to some of these functions that we have, and the extent to which it might then over time make far too available and accessible and free some level of average, right? And so whether we call it a crisis or not is really a choice of rhetoric by which to try and excite other humans to do something about it. I think if you go over any period of time throughout the course of our own industry, you would find groups of people who would look back at the body of work and say that's stagnant. And then be able to also isolate a small percentage of work and then subjectively in groups say that's vanguard, that's state of the art, that's work that works. So I think it's dynamic range. There's always going to be good, better, and best. I mean, we can't have loud without quiet, right?
Right.
So
Well, my personal view is that there's always that 1% exceptional.
yep.
That's never going to change. And what we remember may not be the 1%. We may remember the average. But in any event, I'm going to also ask you what.
And the evidence behind, like if we look at what has happened to work over the course of what would have been considered like Web 2.0 and that digital era of the 2010s, and we look at the rise of performance marketing, and we look at all of the advertising that starts to look like keynote slides and these quick, sharp cuts, and it's work that's assuming great interest and understanding of the brand and the category. And you look at how that propagated in all manner of rectangle in your social feed, and then that editorial style and that creative style started to infect every single medium, that all of a sudden everything is starting to try and look like a performance ad. Like that arc of the impact of that work, that has actually been shown as that dip, that great sort of trough of despair. I think in the third era of effectiveness, I think it's Les Binet, Grace Kite, Tom Roach that presented at Cannes 2 years ago. That's a particular data signature that you can actually see that is often then kind of attributed to essentially trying to do performance marketing at scale across all mediums. And now every channel is trying to essentially quick cut logos, bullet points, this, that, and does never stop enough to engage you emotionally by which to then draw you in to create that memory that we know is so important. Essentially, we're in the memory making business is the way that I look at this whole thing.
I like
And
that.
and I'm not the only one who thinks that in that regard. But and that's something particularly at TRG that we've been really leaning into and pivoting to and really understanding over many decades how some of our most iconic work, how it stood the test of time, that it's still out there, it's still working. It's that compound interest of continuous and consistent creative and how that builds and grows over time. And you create those assets that just are so strong at helping people understand that, that's Home Depot, that's Chick-fil-A, those are those brands, that those become those brands' most valuable assets. And they can't walk away from them. And we might part ways with them as a client, but they can't quit our work because it's their most valuable asset. And a lot of that work is still running in that regard. And so to that degree there is actually is proof that in fact creative at large at scale has shifted in its order of effectiveness, and now we're starting to see a correction on that path. And there are people that are ascribing the correction on that is based on this exchange of information and us getting more fluent in understanding how work works and bringing that into our practices and having that be an expectation. A lot's been written about how the U.S. might be lagging on that subject, but we're not waiting around for it, and we've gone straight in.
Essentially, it's about having patience with your brand as you build your brand. Isn't that what Byron Sharp has been talking about? It's like the distinctive brand assets and your mental availability is something that isn't going to happen quickly. And the example that I got from Henry that I love to use in my training is I'll sing these words. My baloney has a first name. And you could be 30 years old and never eaten Oscar Mayer, but you know the rest of the song
Yeah.
because it's so embedded in our consciousness. No one does
Yeah.
jingles anymore, sadly, but they are a powerful way of creating that emotional resonance.
Yeah, the push to short-termism, and it's the classic, it's like, what are you looking around for? Well, I lost my keys. Or where'd you lose them? Across the street. Well, why are you standing over here? Well, this is where the street light is. It's like you end up with these advertising like objects and assets that can be easily measured in this almost gamification of the metrics, and then that's the work that's getting prioritized. And it's that short-termism that then is then driving a style of creativity that then is sort of propagating itself across, all formats. And then how you start to correct for that is then you start to realize then the power of how, that playing work in the short-term performance marketing is still essential in kind of converting that demand. But if you're not creating that future demand, over that same course of time and playing both speeds simultaneously, then you're not going to be growing, right? And
Mhm.
more than enough evidence to suggest that that is the path forward. That to me becomes one of those fundamental principles that when you work against that, essentially the burden of proof is now on you to suggest that that is the better way, because now there's a mountain of evidence that suggests that that path is wrought with peril. So it's as we start to bring more of these things and understand them in our own practices that then buys us the time, literally the cognitive energy to focus the things that we want to focus on, which is all of that amazing creativity, right, on the top, right? Like that, to make certain that we are still doing what we want to do, which is whether you call it storytelling, and different people have different terms for it, but in making that work that really, really sticks and then has that lasting impact.
Let me pivot and ask you, how would you define your leadership style?
I am a work with, if you're familiar with the concept of power over versus power with, um, I don't really feel like I've worked for anybody or that people work for me. I like working with people. I like the collegiality of that. I like we can do something bigger together. I like to pull things out of people that then excite me and then kind of create new versions of me too in this regard on certain projects. And so it is collaboration with a capital C. It's like the first, you can't spell collaboration without CO, and those are my initials. That's a cheesy way to say it. But like, um, little dad humor mixed with the ad world, so occupational hazard. But like, I would say that that is definitely my style, and from a teaching perspective too, I'd like to get the sense that my students feel like, is he the teacher or is he just like the most excited student? He feels like he's learning along with us. That to me would be the best, like verbatim, like little index card in the opinion box, after leaving one of my classes, if any of my students or coworkers are reading listening or watching this, drop that in the comments if you agree with that. But that's how I would like to definitely, it's the power of and in that regard.
Pick out a project that you've worked on that you are most proud of, or that you found that was most rewarding, and tell us about it. That you can. I don't want you to give away any proprietary
Well,
information, but
so it's interesting, like when I was, finally signing up, to do this, and then really kind of leaning in and understanding and seeing what you're really trying to accomplish and have accomplished. And again, kudos to you and thank you for the work that you and Henry, do out there to not only kind of push forward knowledge of the people behind the work and the practice, but then actually encouraging better practice of all of that is seeing how much of this anchors back to your Creative Brief database. And so I thought, like, well, if I'm going to show up for this, I might as well donate, some briefs to that cause, of which I think there's three.
yes,
And and they're far enough back to where I feel like I don't have to worry about any kind of like client stuff anymore. But yet, it's even the most ancient briefs, and I think to a point you made, and I strongly believe that it is a great learning tool. And some of my favorite briefs that I distribute as a part of the boot camp that I now teach in. We never closed that loop on that whole story. But yeah, so that's something I have done for like almost 19 years now. Is this wonderful? It's a PDF now, but it's a scan of an original document that Jane Newman and both Douglas Atkin provided me as a boot camper in 1999, and it was a spiral bound. And you can find this PDF floating out there. You can find it on Bobby Madison's wonderful strategy link database. In fact, that copy that she has up there was the PDF that I teach with that I had someone photocopy, and I can tell because it has an error in it, right? And it's called the good, the bad, and the ugly Creative Briefs. And it was put together by Merkley Newman Hardy, which again, just strategy ad nerds would know that like Jane Newman was one of the first planners in the US to actually have her name on the side of a US agency. And Douglas Atkin was her head of planning, at that time. And so that to me, that was that, it's a powerful force with regards to just I wouldn't be here talking about any of this had Jane Newman not been Jane Newman here in the US. And we owe so much to her and that original generation of planners, mind you, all women as well. These lionesses of Madison Avenue. That's another subject I'm passionate about. But this is all to say that that document, which I could send to you. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It has some
I
of my
don't think I know of it because I have visited and we've talked to Biba on our show in the past, and I know of her. She has 3 separate pages, one of which is about Creative Brief templates, and she has a small collection of Creative Briefs, and I have borrowed from that and included those briefs on my Creative Brief archive, giving her full credit. I mean, that's where I got them, and I said so. So no, I would love if it's on her page. I'll go back and acquire it.
It has so two of so the Altoids brief originally done by Leo Burnett is in there, as well as
In this document that you're talking about?
in this document, as well as the
Okay.
brief that BMP, which Bozeman Pollitt, but I think in the
Right.
mid-80s was BMP DDB. One of my favorite campaigns was the work they did for The Guardian, of
Oh.
the whole story and the truth from multiple perspectives. That till to this day is one of my single greatest favorite pieces of advertising. So that brief is also in that document. What is common about those briefs is just how pithy it then gets down to that what they refer to as that sort of single proposition, which then brings me. That's the subtext to the answer to your question is a project that I personally worked on. So one of the briefs I provided then to this to your database is was done with for the Sub-Zero Freezer Company, which is a luxury appliance company privately held out of Madison, Wisconsin, and we worked with them for almost 20 years. One of my longest running clients, and what to me is remarkable about that is our ability to actually practice strategy to garner quote unquote insight or insightful learning and have it infuse the brand um, went beyond the bounds of just the advertising. We were actually given access to brief the engineers to actually create new product innovation that went into the products themselves. And so the simple little idea, which just seems so painfully obvious, but when you understand the context and the story behind why it was necessary on the Sub-Zero brief, was this idea that Sub-Zero specializes in freshness, right? Which,
Do you want? I can call up the brief if you want to walk through it or take a look at it.
you know, in some ways, just to answer this question, it's just to know that it has that pithy
Okay.
center in itself, right? And so that then sailed 1,000 ships when it came to you know, the campaign. But what makes this remarkable, and why it's the thing I always call out when somebody asks me the question that you posed, is that it was one thing to build a campaign in sight, sound, motion, print. We even briefed illustrators at the New Yorker to create New Yorker style cartoons in the New Yorker based on this brief. I mean, it's really cool stuff that we did. But when we turned this back at the engineering team, one of the ways they reacted to it, and one of the ways we then encouraged them, is that if you specialize in freshness, you should design a product that makes it as hard as possible to put food inside of that refrigerator in the least fresh places. Like if we are truly a specialist in freshness, we know that there are certain areas and zones, elevations and depths, on the door, not on the door, back and top, down below, where food will be kept its freshest. And this encouraged them then to create these index cards that slid in and out that actually zoned off the interior, that told you, that essentially educated you as to where's the best place to put your arugula versus your dairy versus your this versus your that. And the part to me that is my strategic triumph is that because the worst place inside of a refrigerator is to put milk in the door, right? Because the door swings out and it gets the warmest and back in, that they engineered the depth of the shelving on the door to disallow the placement of milk jugs, of gallon milk.
Too narrow. Too narrow.
Right? What's that?
The shelf was too narrow, so you couldn't put the milk in it?
Yes, exactly. So which then created this wonderful like storytelling element on the showroom floor, because we then actually created point of purchase. Essentially, we made mock milk cartons that had a message that said, "Try and put this on the door," and then we'll, essentially we'll tell you why that's a bad idea. And then you can't do it, and you're like, "What do you mean it can't do it?" Like GE and every other just stainless steel, manufacturer out of some multi, country conglomerate, they allow me to do that all the day. Well, that's because they're generalists and they're just selling another, piece of sheet metal. If you are a specialist in freshness, right, that's not what you do. You respect the food. You give food its due, right? And so it created this wonderful story and this kind of interruptive moment that salespeople could have, in these lavish design rooms where these things are sold. But it was all based on this sort of just pithy little simple idea in the heart of that brief that extended over a campaign, for many years. But again, for me, that accomplishment came back to turning the brief back at the product, back at the engineers and their creativity to literally build those stories and that narrative into the product, right? And to experience that brand idea inside of the product that then became, essentially distinctive assets in the way in which the product was designed.
Well, what it tells me is it tells me about the intrepidness of a strategist. This is you've heard the story about the Capodastro bar? I've told it many
I
times.
have, because I've watched those episodes. But
yeah,
to me, it's a good example of that.
Exactly. In this case, the copywriter who went to the piano manufacturing headquarters was not satisfied with the information he'd acquired from the marketers and the blah, 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 and wanted to learn more. And that's what you did. You dug deeper, didn't accept the whole, I don't know if even the notion of parity between one refrigerator and another was even part of the discussion, but clearly you discovered it's not. This refrigerator has something unique about it, and you found it. That's what I love.
Yeah, it's,
That's if I might have been a good strategist if I were to start my career over. My curiosity about life, about learning new things, I think might have made me a pretty decent strategist.
I'm looking forward to a Howard that at some point will say I am a strategist, right?
Okay.
That to me will be success, is to give yourself permission to identify, in that regard, because
I'm a strategic creative. I'm working my way up.
right. And
Henry has given me permission to say, Howard, you're a strategic creative. I said, okay. Well, so I got another question here. We're just going and going here, and I'm loving this conversation. Where do you go to find inspiration?
Oh my goodness. This is the unique, this is a burden we carry, particularly as strategists. There's this desire that we're supposed to be inspiring other people. We're supposed to be activating creativity. And I do believe that strategy is the first creative act, right? It's not the final
Absolutely.
act, right? And whether it was Sir Haggerty that said that, or whether it was um, Abbott from AMV who may have said that. I've tried to source that who quoted that, and I always get like two different answers on that. But um, in that regard, that puts us in the situation always trying to be giving. So what happened when our well runneth dry? Well, who inspires the inspirer, right? In this regard. And this is you have to take personal responsibility to keep your life interesting, and I feel to continue to be effective in this industry, that is something you definitely need to bring into your practice. Just like if you were a professional athlete or performer or singer, you need to take care of your voice, you need to take care of your body, whatever it might be, is finding a way to take care of your own curiosity, and to deal and be very cognizant of when you're feeling burnt out and your jadedness and all of this. These are things that we rub up against. And so, for me, it is, and also another thing as a strategist, you don't ever turn it off. And I think for a lot of creative class people, this is the case, is you don't turn that off. So when I'm trying to enjoy a new series I've discovered, um, there is always a part of me that is thinking about what the showrunners are trying to accomplish and how they got it green lit, and what they're referencing this series off of, and what series came before it that was successful enough to say, you know what, we should do this one. Like, what audience is into this? Like, I'm always processing all these kinds of things, and it can get and it can feel tiring in that regard.
I think you do need to, if not turn it off, give it a rest.
Yeah, and
Because
this is
if
where
you,
mindful practice is very important, and
yeah,
this is another reason maybe to have Biba back on the podcast, just because I think a world with more Biba is a better place on Strategy Planet, is to talk to her about her meditation, mindful practice, and pulling that back into the mental health of
that's
being a
what I
strat.
do. I have a daily meditation practice. It's something that it's just part of my life.
I think
I get
yesterday was
that.
International Mental Health Day as well, so it's
Yeah.
very timely in this regard. So to me, it is trying to practice, mindfulness in this regard. I mean, it's, music for me has always been kind of my yoga. And I've also, although I've kind of fallen out of practice right now, I've always kind of been into that. It's almost like a physical meditation. It's a chance to kind of clear and reset the mind. I'm the kind of person who can sit down and I will sit down and I will put on a record, and I will listen to it, side A to side B, in the liturgical order in which it was, deemed set fit to tell the story. And I will just kind of lose myself and let it wash over me. And that to me does help me reset, in that regard. When it comes to inspiration, I find a lot of my inspiration coming maybe outside of advertising proper into just the social sciences and just kind of understanding what we know more about why humans make decisions and how we've evolved, and just more of what we're discovering about why we are who we are, and all this kind of stuff. I find that kind of there's other strategists that I have also seen as my kind of remote ambient mentors, Mark Earls or someone like that, who wrote the book Herd, who really helps us better understand just kind of how humans kind of operate, at scale. More modern practitioners like Dr. Marcus Collins, who has a great book for the culture, if you haven't checked that out, that has a modern take on that, riffing off of a great Griffin Farley from BBH days, who passed away, unfortunately, in 2010. I did have a chance to meet him at a conference back in the day, and like them, they were inspired by network effects and behavioral science and these things that laterally sit outside or are adjacent to advertising as an industry. But yet, if you just think about, we're just essentially trying to help humans make decisions, and then really it's all the same, right? It's all the same at that level. And that's where I seek and continue to seek a lot of inspiration. And it's where it brought me to the discovery of better understanding that there is this kind of unifying theory of marketing effectiveness that's coming together with a number of institutions that are going through the process of peer review and breaking through replication crisis, whether it's the work of the IPA, Binet and Field, Ehrenberg Bass, James Herman, work popularizing all of this. What's talked about at Lion, at Cannes as a part of the Lions programming, and all those things. Then I start to realize are pulling in all of that learning, and now I'm starting to realize, no, it's like I've always felt. It's always been a part of the same knowledge base. And so yeah, so when I want to turn it off, it's music and mindfulness, or a really good hot shower, right? Of just sensory deprivation, altered states, just like just turn it all off and just feel this one thing, and zone out. But when I want to turn it on, it really gets back to social science and just kind of understanding this crazy pale blue dot that we all live on, and just the sheer improbability that any of this is the way it is. And that to me that's so magical and amazing and fantastic upon itself. That to me provides me in some cases enough of story. And I love sci-fi. I love all these other things, but I think some of the best fantasy is actually all around us if we just kind of like look into it. And yeah.
Where does AI fit into your workday? Are you embracing it? How are you using it?
100%, all the time. It is my favorite sparring partner. It is my confidant. It is where I go to play through ideas before I might take them full bright. It is where I go to argue with myself. I've created GPTs that are cognizant of my own blind spots. I have GPTs that call BS on some of my thinking. It goes back to I think it's Sarah Carter who loves to say this. It's like, we are not the customer, right? We are not the customer.
Mhm.
So to me, it's like a sparring partner. I call them my little cogs, my little cognitive assistants that help me think through certain things, before I then get humans involved. I very quickly get other humans involved. And so I'm not and nor do I at this point, am espousing for there be one person super soldier planning departments of nothing but one person piloting AI, right? I can see use cases for this, but to me, I think, AI is so empowering that if I can get someone who is really good at using it and has found a way to bring it into their practice, I want to hire 10 more of them.
Yeah,
As
we had
opposed,
a
yeah.
panel discussion the last couple of weeks with all creatives, and a number of the creatives really expressed, well, anxiety might be too calm a word about how the perception is that it's going to take work away from creatives. I don't know if I agree with that, but interestingly, when we were talking to Rob Schwartz just the other day, who will be on in a few weeks. He loves, like you, he loves using, I don't know which version of AI he uses, but he has his own generative AI tool, or maybe tools, that he goes back and forth. And we were joking about it. He said, you could start your own podcast called The Prompt Brothers, because it's really about asking the right questions, learning how to give the tool good prompts. And until you learn how to do that, it's not going to be very useful. I thought, well, that's really a good point. I've gotten a little bit better at asking more focused questions. I could be probably a lot more creative than I have been in asking questions. Are you a good prompter?
So when I think of prompting as a limiter or something that brings up performance anxiety, I think more mid-journey, right? Where it gets a little closer to there being very specific prompts to get outcomes. When I think of OpenAI's platform or ChatGPT that I use, the natural language model allows me to speak with AI as if I would speak with anyone else. So just as specific or vague or ambiguous or unhinged or crazy or whatever that I would speak with a coworker or whatever or give someone direction, I'm using the same language in ChatGPT. So to me, there are no limitations in ChatGPT. I'm not expecting any more or less fidelity of outcome than the interaction I might have with someone else based on the language that I'm using. I mean, so so in that regard, it's wonderful to play with and to have fun with, and so
Oh, I
you
agree.
just start to play around with it, and there's the maybe kind of again bridging some subjects here in this regard. I mean, we both share a passion for training and learning and particularly for practitioners in their early career, but I would argue at any stage of their career at this point. One of the things, and I'll give a shout out. So I'm also on the strategy committee of the 4As, which gets together every other month, and it's strategy leaders from different 4As agencies that just talk shop. And one of the cool things that they kicked up last year was this sort of an early career strategist, and I think they call it junior. I hate the term junior strategist, right? But early career strategy committee that put together a little task force, and they came back with like what their cause was essentially the lack of training, of just kind of getting let out to dry and there not being a training program. And one of the insights that came back with in this wonderful strategist, her name is Stephanie Collins down at GSD&M, that delivered this in this presentation that she was presenting back to us, was this finding that they had that essentially it is fear of asking a question or not knowing something that you think the rest of the room thinks you should already know, right? That you're not going to ask the question because you think someone else thinks you should already know it. And this
Hmm.
to me is and then they came up with this sort of curriculum program, kind of app card thing to kind of deal with, right? But this to me is a wonderful use case for AI, because the AI will not judge you when you don't know something. So if you're overhearing a conversation and or something on LinkedIn where you're seeing people going on about the difference, but there is a difference between distinctiveness and differentiation. And if you're on the outside of that conversation, you're like, people are arguing about the thesaurus. This is nuts. Like, dude, what are these people doing for a living, right? But like when you see that going on, that's the kind of thing that sets up the performance anxiety around, like, well, should I have known that or not? Do I want to admit to it? And then you're left out. Go into ChatGPT and ask it, why is everybody all upset about this, right? And who is this Mark Ritson guy? And da 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 da. Like, and you could have this honest conversation that you would be unwilling to have with maybe a colleague or a peer that might, judge you for some reason. Oh, you don't know who so and so is, and what did I, well, you haven't read the red book, blah blah blah, right? Like, let the GPT be your little chamber to like ask, like, what should I know about this? Like, well, that's crazy. What doesn't make any sense? Oh, builds confidence up, and now you're ready to have the conversation. Now it brings the confidence into the room, for you then to have that opinion, and that combination of like confidence times opinion in some ways is like that's the simple algorithm that makes most strategists work. Confidence times opinion equals essentially your job, what you're being expected to do. So building up that confidence through use of AI as a sparring partner, as a confidant that you can go, I think this is nuts. What do they mean that, um, fill in the blank, whatever the thing might be that's being discussed with a client or account, or what is EBITDA, right? Like, quick, hot in a moment, you're in a meeting early in your career, and all of a sudden all these acronyms get thrown around, and you don't
I,
want to like ask the question for fear of being judged. Well, boom, now you know.
I didn't know what that term meant until I worked on the client side. It's like, what the fuck are you talking about? EBITDA.
Yeah.
And someone actually, it's an acronym. Yeah. I want to ask you about creative briefs. Let's just get right to it. And before I do, I just want to come out and say again, you mentioned your donation. I want to say thank you publicly for you delivering to me 3 of these creative briefs, which are about 20 years old, to the Creative Brief Archive. It is a monumentally difficult task to get people to donate briefs because they are proprietary. And I understand that. So your willingness to share with me, because I'm not making any money off this. It's all free. You just register and you can download, you can review, you can comment, you can share, you can do anything you want. And I use these creative briefs as tools for my training. I think the best way to learn how to write a brief is to study even bad briefs. You can learn from bad briefs. And I have more than a few bad briefs. I don't mean to say that about student briefs, because student briefs we look at differently. They're the training tools. So first of all, just thank you for that donation. I really appreciate it. And I hope that others out there listening will feel a little bit more comfortable about making a similar donation. Go back 20 years. I don't care. Because as I mentioned to you in my email, if we didn't believe that if we believe that the only tools that will help us are new, we wouldn't have art museums.
Right. Yeah.
Students wouldn't spend their times with an easel and a canvas and their oils sitting in front of a master, copying it to understand brushstroke, to understand shadowing and those details that a painter must master. We need to study how a brief that exists came about, and the best way to do that is to read it. I've seen so many things online that says this is the question you need to ask in the brief. Then you need to ask this question. Then you need to ask this question. I said, great, I understand that. Show me how to write the answer. You learn that from reading from a brief. So thank you for your donation. Now,
and those 3 briefs are, for anyone interested, if they're listening, I've mentioned the one for a Sub-Zero Freezer company, right?
yep.
And the second one for a Patron Spirits, particularly was their tequila. And then GameStop, the retailer.
Right.
And these are all circa 05, 06, right? And so
And that's around the time that Sarah Walker Hall wrote her brief for Kiwi Shoe Polish.
correct.
Who was one of your hires, one of whom I know you were very proud. So I wanted to ask you a question about creative briefs. Now, Henry says that he doesn't spend an awful lot of time writing briefs because he has direct reports. I'm sure the same is true for you. The briefs that you write and the briefs that you review from your direct reports, are they getting better? Are they staying the same? What would you say is the status of the quality of briefs? And I ask this as a creative because I know that creatives bitch and moan about the quality of briefs, but I'm wondering, is that just an old habit? We just bitch and moan because we've always bitched and moaned? Or are briefs getting better? Are they getting worse? Are they staying the same? What's your take?
So there's I don't feel client briefs have gotten much better coming in. I still feel like the incoming information, when it happens, is often very problematic. And like any process, GIGO, right? Garbage in, garbage out. The fidelity of the
Right.
output is only as good as the fidelity of the input. So when I think of a creative brief, I think upstream too, right? Like, and so it starts with that client brief coming in. I've not seen, despite wonderful efforts of like the Better Briefs initiative, and a number of people talking about that as well. I've not really seen meaningful, improvement in that regard. When it comes to the creative brief itself, I've gone through my own, eras, if you will, as a planner strategist with regards to my relationship or appreciation for a creative brief. I think the briefs that I donated, are definitely indicative of my minimalist period, right? Where I felt like if you could not say this in less than 2 lines, and I know we've talked about the original Richards Group Creative Brief. One of the things it confined everything to one page. Literally, it was originally designed in a FileMaker database document that disallowed you to type outside the boxes, so that it would never be more than one page. Because I firmly believe a great brief never met a staple in its life. Never,
Yeah,
never.
I mean the ultimate definition of liberating constraint.
Yes, right, right. So, I mean, like when I teach creative briefs at boot camp, it's like, listen, you want the 3 hour version, or you want the 3 second version, right? Like, and 3 second version is a great creative brief is two things, creative and brief, right? So, borrowing from John Steele, and I think it was even Pam Scott, who was a great planner at Goodby back in the day at the boot camp. That was one of the people. In fact, what's funny is, like, back when I went to the boot camp in '99, it's like, regardless of the subject or topic that any one of those amazing planners had, they always wanted to talk about the creative brief. So if it was 10 weeks, we got 10 different versions of what a creative brief should or shouldn't be, with 10 different examples. And it was, I described it as like this sort of like Las Vegas buffet, where you've got like the lobster next to the jello, next to the omelet, next to the steak, next to the tuna fish. It's like, it's just, you just like, it's how but you pick and choose what you want. Like, in the end, there was a lot of uh, contradicting things. But one of the things that I pulled off the buffet from the boot camp that you can definitely see when in these early briefs that would have been then in my first 5-6 years post boot camp was absolute minimalism, reductionism, pithiness. Like, just optically speaking, if it broke a second line, if I couldn't get it to one line, it broke a second line. It was just all about removing words, as much as possible, to really lean into the brief aspect, of this. Forgive me for the length of this letter, for I lack the time to make it short. It was
Yep.
always about that reductivism for that document. And that to me was then, again, it was just sort of part of the practice, and something that was almost kind of fun in a way. How tight can we get this? But if I'm very honest with myself, and how I felt then, and then what really emerged to me over time, is that my favorite part of a creative brief is that it was essentially an excuse to collaborate and talk with creatives and do a briefing. If you ever start something called the Briefing Bros, let me be your third wheel.
Well, I mean, what we say at the beginning of each show is we love to talk about advertising, creative briefs, and briefing, because
Things.
there are two separate things, and it's often confused as being just a synonym for the same thing when it's not.
So my heart is with briefings with a capital B, and
Mhm.
interactive, immersive, putting on a show, debate, dialogue, engaging multiple senses. It is the antithesis of, to me, which is the worst form of what often happens to creative briefs, is when they're just dropped on a Slack channel,
Yeah. Oh,
emailed, passed through. Like that to me is that should, right.
I
Yeah.
do an entire workshop on briefing. You've got your brief. Now, how do you present it?
How do you bring it to life? So in
How
that
do you bring it
regard,
to life? Yeah.
and
I
it's
think
and
that
it
I think the operating point, the operating philosophy has to be, this is the one meeting that everybody at your agency wants to attend because you're witnessing a show.
Yeah, right. It's something to get wrapped up in,
Mhm.
and to feel something, to engage multiple senses. And again, this kind of falls back on behavioral science. We know that when we can engage at least three senses, the amount of engagement, memory creation goes up exponentially, right? And so, like, and now doing this in this sort of, post, we're back to office for the most part. We're at TRG, we're hybrid, so Monday, Friday, be where we want, but Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we call our anchor days. So most of our briefings happen then on one of those anchor days, to encourage that, in that regard. But yes, and a creative brief might be typed by the strategist, but it should feel authored by the team.
Mm.
It should be
Mm.
a collaborative, co-creative process, where it's not walking in and saying, "Hey, want to buy a watch?" It's not like revealing the last minute this idea to creative teams who are arms crossed or worst camera off or whatever it might be. Like it's having socialized that with enough, and we don't often need like 100% agreement. We just need enough to get the spidey senses going in that regard. And I feel the pursuit of the perfect brief should be secondary to having the perfect room, of putting the right people in the right room for that briefing and having it be as cross-disciplinary as possible, of not about the relay baton race. It was Andy Grayson, who's a strategy leader at Arts and Letters up in Richmond. I remember listening to this On Strategy Showcase podcast with Fergus, and I remember like driving, and it was this episode with Andy, and one of the few moments where I literally had to stop, pull the car over, and it's like, this is exactly how I feel about what we do. And he's saying that, and like, yet, bro, like, I'm high-fiving just the air in the car, right? Like this idea that stop worrying about the perfect brief, think about the perfect room. Putting together a group of cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary thinkers early on in the process that move together, that then work to solve that problem in a nonlinear way, as this consummate just hot potato, pass the baton, client sits with it too long, goes to brand management, or account service sits with it too long, goes to planners if sit with it too long. Meanwhile, clock's ticking, deadline's not moving, right? And like that whole pageantry of that whole kind of show and tell thing, as opposed to, no, as soon as we know there's a project, bring the team together. It's going to be responsible for bringing creativity to solve that problem, get them activated as soon as possible. And that to me is then messing around with the core idea of the brief, is to then very quickly get to a briefing. In which case, like the actual document is made available at the end of the meeting, or maybe sent later, but we're not sitting there and reading it and looking at it. I mean, there are some circumstances where that might be the more practical thing to do, but you're still together and there's a guided conversation. So it's the drive-by, it's the conversations that I'm encouraging the team, to have with the strategists, to have with the creative teams long before they're given something that starts to feel like a work order or a jury summons. It's like, it's like, if you want to feel like you were a part of this process.
That's the key. I can't tell you how many times I go out to do training and I ask the question, okay, who here writes the brief? And someone raises their hand. And I say, well, tell me how you write your brief. So, we collaborate. We always collaborate. Okay, tell me how the collaboration works. Well, I write a draft and then I send it out for feedback. I said, that's not collaboration. That's an act of masochism. Because then you have to figure out whose comments am I going to give weight to. And we always give we pay the most attention to our boss's comments. And now the audience for the brief has changed. So I love what you're saying about the creatives have to be involved early on in the process. And Henry talks about this a lot himself. He always takes an early draft, even if it's not complete, to his creative director and says, let me just get a sense for where I'm going here. So I always recommend a writing buddy, because most of the people in my training are not strategists like you. They're marketers. So get a writing buddy. Better yet, workshop it. Loop in a creative. I don't know how many companies are doing it that way. I don't know if the agencies are doing it that way, because I could count on one. I can tell you, I've done training at ad agencies. I can count on one hand how many agencies have invited me in to do training. It's always marketers. It's always marketers. So I love the way you're thinking, but then I kind of knew I was going to love that even before we started this conversation.
Yeah, and it's a microcultural thing too. It's like there are certain teams within teams inside of an agency that you start to learn that are more or less into that, right? Like, so like, the relationships that you build with your team member. Again, effectiveness is a team sport, and getting to work that works, there's a certain level of trust that's necessary in that regard.
Absolutely. That's the one part of the brief that's not it's not in the brief, but it's the most important element of the brief.
Right. And so, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Julian Cole shared with us that he has learned how to truly understand the creatives that he's working with. He said some creatives are like professors who are strategic and they ask a lot of questions, like why? And then there are some creatives who are more like artists and they are doers and they simply want to solve the problem. And so he briefs them differently because they're two different kinds of mindsets. So your job as a strategist is to truly understand your audience in the agency.
Your immediate audience. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's these concentric circles of humans that you have to understand, right? And form enough of a working relationship with to actually finally get out to the real humans that you're trying to make a memory with, And so, but paying the most attention to all of those humans throughout all of those concentric circles essentially falls back on the charge of what I would feel is a capable strategist in that regard. Yeah.
Well, Christopher Owens, we could go on and on and on, and we've had a great conversation, and Henry's going to be editing this and wondering what the heck, how did it's like, we've been talking for an hour and 30, 40 minutes, something. We're going to turn this into 2 episodes.
And we never talked about Sarah Walker Hall or anything else too, which I
Well,
thought might go to, but it's other than to say that I think the multiple episodes you did with her are just testament to her brilliance, her passion, her precision.
yeah, I was
Wonderful.
so impressed. And she was not ready to accept. She didn't like the first draft of that brief, and she went out with her camera back in the day when cameras were not digital and did good old-fashioned field work. That's so impressive. And that's a backstory that I get to share now with my students when I teach that brief.
That's right.
That's wonderful. And kudos to you for bringing her on board, for hiring her.
Yeah. So, I mean, I helped her defect from she was an account supervisor over to planning with our nomenclature back then. So I was not the original hire, but I was the person that helped her defect, and then someone that worked with her very closely and as to help her grow. Again, goes back to that question of leader. It's sort of like power with, work with.
Right.
And it was always my relationship with Sarah. It was just about kind of getting out of her way, running interference, finding the opportunities to support her whenever she needed it. And but she was one of those strategists, and I've had a rare occasion to have sort of multiple versions of these experiences where you have someone who just feels so naturally gifted in this regard, and you are just trying to get out of their way in that regard, and then just be available whenever you're needed in to help them break through a barrier or whatever that might be. And so in a nutshell, that's essentially any more subtext that you need to that, but continue to support her and encourage her in her career no matter where she ends up out there in the world.
Well, thank you for reminding us about Sarah and her contributions to TRG and her brilliance as a strategist. I'm glad you brought that up. So Christopher Owens, extraordinary teacher, head of strategy at TRG. Thank you for joining me on the Brief Brothers. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much. And again, kudos to all that you do. I mean, where we can get out there and help people learn and getting excited and have passion for this practice, the better it is for the industry at large. And so again, thank you, Howard, and to Henry, all that you do, and look forward to maybe coming back some other time.
That would good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
He's Howard Ibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye bye.